It was a brilliant race at Imola this afternoon with changeable conditions, and round 2 of the 2021 season has gone to Max Verstappen, as he made sure that his bad form in Italy has not continued. There's a lot to talk about from this week's race, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Changeable conditions. It's fun when there are changeable conditions. Even before lights out, you had Alonso in the barrier, a puncher for Valtteri Bottas, and even Stroll's brakes caught fire on the way to the grid. And then Vettel ended up starting in the pit lane, making it the second race in a row that Vettel was near the back at the start. Plus, even Charles Leclerc spun on the formation lap, so it's absolutely a green box for changeable conditions, because it just makes for exciting racing to watch. The teams had a lot of work to do before the start, with a number of them looking at cooling systems. I can imagine it was tough for the teams given that even though these cars are similar to last season, it's the first wet running that the teams have been able to do. And they had 1 or 2 installation laps on the way to the grid to work out whether anything needed doing. It reminded me a bit of the Hungarian Grand Prix last year, where Verstappen ended up in the barrier on the way to the grid and the Haas drivers dived into the pits after the formation lap to change to dry tyres. Once the lights went out though in Imola, it was quite frankly chaos, with Verstappen having a great start using second gear off the line to overtake Perez and Hamilton before making contact with the Mercedes car. It was swiftly followed by a spin for Latifi, followed by a trip to the barrier, and then a mistake from Schumacher to lose his front wing, and then not being able to go back into the pits to get a replacement as it was closed. It was an interesting opening few laps to say the least, and it's exactly what we like to see in Formula 1. Under the safety car, we had Perez's off into the gravel, losing positions to Gasly and Ricciardo, which he swiftly took back, which subsequently got the Mexican driver a 10-second penalty. An interesting one and an odd decision from Perez to take back those positions, and although he didn't lose out too much given he restarted the race in 4th, his mistake after that restart ultimately cost him this weekend. After a while under changeable conditions, the Gasly train started, as he was the only driver left on wet tyres and he plummeted down the field as he was 8 seconds per lap down on the other cars on intermediates around him. It was a dreadful strategy call, so who knows what radar the AlphaTauri guys were looking at. It led to a great start to the race with exciting battles up and down the order, with all of the teams taking their time to work out when it would be best to switch to the dry tyres. It's not something that I look for every weekend with changeable conditions, but it's certainly nice to see from time to time. Mercedes Meltdown. And whilst it was looking good, certainly for Hamilton in the early stages, it all fell apart within 2 laps. So I think it must be a red box for Mercedes this weekend, with difficulties for Hamilton and with Bottas and Russell, their junior driver, colliding. First up, we had a rare error from Lewis Hamilton, as he ended up going through the gravel into the barrier whilst he was the fastest driver out on the circuit and was well and truly hunting down Max Verstappen ahead of him. I thought Hamilton showed his vast amount of experience to not rush his way out of the gravel. Instead, he chose to keep the revs low and reverse all the way back out to ensure he didn't get beached, and that absolutely paid off, given the other incident with the Mercedes drivers meant he could come back so well to take second place, and he displayed his patience behind Sainz, Leclerc and Norris towards the end of the race. And then you have the incident on lap 32, which was between the other 2 Mercedes drivers, in Valtteri Bottas and George Russell. It was a shocking crash, and I'm incredibly thankful that both drivers came out okay on this one. But as for the incident itself, well, I think Bottas was just following the racing line. Perhaps he didn't see Russell coming through on the right-hand side, and given it's unlike the Williams car to be as quick as it has been this weekend, it wouldn't be a surprise if that was the case. But at the same time, it isn't really an excuse. I think both drivers were at fault here, and it was a shame to see the 2 drivers coming together who are probably in competition for a Mercedes seat next season. It means that for a second season running at Imola, George Russell has been running inside the points before crashing out under the safety car last year and colliding with Bottas this year. Those points in the Williams car continue to be elusive for him, but I have no doubt that they will come at some point this year based on the team's performance this weekend. As for Bottas, well, it was a pretty tough weekend already after a disappointing performance in qualifying as he ended up starting in 8th. It left Lewis Hamilton on his own against the 2 Red Bulls. It's certainly been a while since that has happened, as it's usually the other way around. Plus, in the race, he had once again struggled to make up positions in a similar way to his performance last season in Turkey. The incident with Russell, and well, he could and perhaps should have moved across to ensure there was enough space for Russell alongside him. down into the first braking zone. And at the same time, Russell could and perhaps should have made sure he didn't put a wheel on the grass. Lando Norris's second career podium. It would be impossible to talk about this race without calling out an impressive drive for Lando Norris, which has definitely earned him a green box. After the disappointment with his fastest Q3 time being deleted for track infringements, on social media at least, Lando Norris looked a bit down after his qualifying performance. But he came in today and meant business. And it was a great drive from the McLaren driver as he came past so many cars in the wet weather to then have team orders to get past Ricciardo early on. It was then a bold move from McLaren to pick the soft tyres on both cars at the restart, which allowed Lando to make a great move down into turn 1 on Charles Leclerc. He then held that position for a long time before losing out to Lewis Hamilton in the closing stages, but an absolutely stellar drive for Lando Norris this weekend to take his second career podium, with a third place finish ending up ahead of the Ferrari drivers, whilst Ricciardo ended up 6th. It has to be said that these first 2 races of the season have definitely been in favour of Lando Norris so far, with a 4th place in Bahrain and a 3rd place in Imola. He definitely means business and wants to be that number 1 driver at McLaren, as he said at the launch. His maturity throughout this race, particularly when it came to the close racing with Hamilton towards the end, was clear to see, and he's now in his 3rd season in Formula 1, and I'm seriously impressed, as he sits 3rd in the Drivers' Championship. Track limits. The 4th point to talk about is track limits, which was a contentious issue following the Bahrain Grand Prix, with there being discrepancies in the way in which the FIA were ruling on track limits at turn 4 between practice sessions and the race. It was an odd ruling in the first place, which was exacerbated by the fact that Max Verstappen had passed on the outside at that corner off the track. Coming into this weekend at Imola, it was always going to be a hot topic, not only because of the incidents in Bahrain, but also because of the fact that this circuit had issues with track limits last year. Huge numbers of lap times were deleted in October, so the track was already one that had a reputation for drivers pushing the boundaries of the edge of the track to gain some extra lap time. Personally, I think track limits get a green box for me this weekend, as the FIA have done a much better job than they did last year. For starters, the rules were clearly outlined before the start of the first practice sessions. There were some amendments, but only at turn 13 where the limits were no longer being enforced. But the rules were always clear, and everyone knew where they stood. The key difference between Imola and Bahrain is the fact that the corner exits in question at Imola can be monitored using timing loops. So any breaches of track limits are flagged and then can be checked manually based on the camera feed. So if there are any lessons learned, it must be that electronic systems need to be in place. In qualifying, I thought the stewards did an impressive job of deleting times pretty quickly after each lap, so the drivers knew when their lap time had been deleted almost immediately, which was probably aided by these electronic timing loops. Plus, as fans, we all know what the order was, and there was little confusion. A few drivers did get caught up with track limits in quali, with Sergio Perez once again having his first Q2 time deleted for track limit violations. Pierre Gasly had a couple of lap times deleted, and then, as I mentioned earlier, Lando Norris also had his final Q3 run deleted, which was a mighty lap. So it was good that the drivers were being penalised for exceeding the track limits. It feels like whether gravel trap or grass is inappropriate, this method employed for qualifying with electronic timing loops is a good one. Then we come into the race, which is where the FIA really made the mistake last time out. This time around though, race director Michael Massey made it very clear from the beginning of the weekend there was a 3-strike rule to be implemented, as has been seen in other races in the past. It's simple enough, so I'm glad the FIA managed to get it right this time. We didn't see much of it in the race given the conditions, other than I think a warning for Yuki Tsunoda, but I do think that the FIA deserves some credit for this weekend. A wet weather masterclass from Max. The final point to mention is just how wet conditions really do expose the best drivers, and the best do tend to rise to the front of the order. So it has to be a green box for Max Verstappen for his Sunday afternoon performance. While a number of more experienced drivers made errors this afternoon, and particularly while Bottas, Hamilton and Perez all struggled and made errors, Max Verstappen was simply in a class of his own, as he drove to a good lead from the start and another commanding lead on the restart, when he didn't have many competitive cars around him. It was a great drive to see and he managed it so well. He's taken his first podium in Italy and it was a comfortable victory, so congratulations to Max, and he did all he could to put the pressure on Hamilton in the championship, which is certainly shaping up to be a close one, with pole positions and race wins now one apiece between himself and Hamilton so far this season. and the championship order being decided at the moment by just a single point. It's not the first time that we've seen Max Verstappen displaying his wet weather abilities either, thinking back to that win in Germany a couple of years ago, and I'm sure it won't be the last time we see it either. As for a final bonus point, another thing we learned from this race was how not to name a Grand Prix. The official title was the Formula 1 Pirelli Gran Premio del Made in Italy e Dell'Emilia Romagna 2021, as the sponsorship rights were sold to both Pirelli and Made in Italy. It was a tricky one to say the least, so it's no wonder the pundits and journalists chose to shorten it to the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Given how chaotic this race was, there were also points that I've definitely missed. From the Ferraris having a very strong outing with both drivers, despite Sainz's mistakes early on in the race, Yuki Tsunoda's recovery drive before dropping back at the restart, and then of course Alfa Romeo's first points of the season with a couple for Kimi Räikkönen. So that's my 5 things we learned from the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. What did you learn, and what did I miss? Make sure to let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video and watched this far, then thanks for watching, and make sure to hit that subscribe button for more videos like this one throughout the 2021 F1 season.